I have the honor actually of introducing the speaker for today, so this is a good thing. Although there's children next door, next to me playing with the dryer, so hopefully you can't hear that. That's the fun of being at home, I suppose, with Zoom, right? So, John is an associate professor of biology at Regis University. I had the pleasure of getting to know him there when I taught a course for him, actually, several years back now. He got his MS degree in geography from Penn State, PhD in geography from University of Tennessee. He's a biogeographer. His particular kind of research interests have to do with vegetation dynamics, particularly in temperate forests. He works on things like forest structure and composition in response to fire. He's also worked related to climate and disturbance, as well as kind of response of vegetative communities to climate disturbances in particular. That latter half of what I just talked about there has to do primarily with alpine treeline communities in particular. John, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I thought you were chair at some point, maybe recently, if not today, of the biology department there at Regis. But he's in biology, but is a physical geographer by training, and teaches across things like forest ecology, quantitative ecology, GIS, climate change. Of course, the geology class is what I taught for him in the past, and then of course environmental science. And from what I understand,
I think we lost Tom. Is he? Uh-oh. Tom got there. He's back.
Tom, we lost you there for a minute.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know where I was. Sorry that I did get a little message here that said my internet was unstable. Sorry about that. So anyway, teaches across, different biology and physical realms. And like I said, I'll just kind of hand it over to you, John, and you can start from there. We're happy to have you here. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thanks everybody for showing up today on Friday afternoon. Yeah, I'm a geographer by training, and it feels really good to talk to a geography department. Yeah, I'm at so Regis here down the road from you all is a small liberal arts college. And as Tom mentioned, I have to teach in a lot of different areas because we're a relatively small faculty. So yeah, I teach some earth science, I teach some GIS and climate change, I teach ecology and quantitative ecology. And so, yeah, my research is mostly on vegetation dynamics and mostly changes in forests in response to disturbance and in response to climate and in response to land use change and those kinds of things. So yeah, if I can share my screen here, I'll get to what I'm talking about today. Okay. Can everybody see my screen okay? Or are you seeing my presenter view? Oh, okay. All right. So yeah.
The presenter view there.
The presenter view? Okay.
Yeah.
If you'll bear with me a second, I can maybe change my settings. I realized this came up once as in a class, and the students were always one slide ahead of me. I'm sorry, I can't find it. well, if we can, actually, maybe I can do this. How about that? Is that better?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay. All right. I apologize for that delay. The joys of remote interaction. Anyway, so today I'm going to talk about some of my research that I've been doing in the Southwest in Guadalupe Mountains National Park, which is in West Texas. Now, this is a project I'm going to first I'm going to talk about the Guadalupes because I just think it's a really interesting place. So I'll give you some background on the Guadalupes. Then I'm going to tell an old story. This research actually started like 15 years ago when I was a graduate student. And then I'm going to tell a newer story based on a more recent wildfire that occurred in the park. So the Guadalupe Mountains are located in West Texas. The Guadalupe mountain range kind of comes from southeast New Mexico down into West Texas. And the very southern tip of the range, the part that kind of pokes down into Texas is the national park, Guadalupe Mountains National Park. This is the mountain range is really a sky island like we see in a lot of the Southwest. It's surrounded by Chihuahuan Desert. So here we're to the west side of the range and we're looking east and you can see the escarpment there. So we're in the Chihuahuan Desert. There's big gypsum dunes and all sorts of cool desert vegetation down here. And the relief here is about 3,000 feet. So it's about 5,500 feet down here in the desert and about 8,500 feet to some of the higher peaks of the range. It's part of the geology of the Guadalupes is really interesting. I couldn't help myself because I do teach a little geology. So it's Permian aged fossilized reef. It's actually one of the best preserved fossilized reefs in the world. And so the reef kind of encircled what's called the Delaware Basin, which was an extension of ocean, which eventually got kind of cut off and dried up. And so there's all sorts of really interesting evaporite deposits and things in there. And some places the reef has been uplifted and exposed. So the dark brown here is the Guadalupe Mountains, that's exposed there. We've got some other mountain ranges that are parts of the reef that have been uplifted as well. And then some of that limestone reef is down underground. So Carlsbad Caverns is notably part of some of these limestone layers from the Permian reef. So of course, there's all sorts of cool fossils and things there. This is some of the limestone that makes up some of the reef. Because this is Permian, there wasn't coral back then in the Permian. So the reef building organisms were bryophytes, anyway, the algae and some other sort of really early reef building organisms. But anyway, there's fossils everywhere and lots of limestone and really interesting stuff like that. Because of the elevation, we do have mixed conifer forests up on top of the escarpment, and it's pretty extensive. So it's a really great place for wildlife. It's a hot spot for birds. This is a Mexican spotted owl, an endangered species that you find there. There's mule deer and still some elk and mountain lions and all sorts of interesting things. So it's a real hot spot for biodiversity as well. And so like I mentioned, it really is a sky island kind of ecosystem. We have these through Arizona and New Mexico in the Southwest, where when you get up to higher elevations in these mountain ranges, it's cooler and you have enough moisture to support forests. In a lot of the sky islands, most of the sky islands, you have ponderosa pine forests. In the Guadalupes, we have some ponderosa pine, but also mixed conifer forests. So we have a lot of Douglas fir, alligator juniper, pinyon pine, and a lot of southwestern white pine as well. Because it's really arid, and of course, because it's limestone, we don't have a lot of surface water. All that water goes down, comes out at the base of the range where there's some impermeable rock layers and you have springs. But it is very dry, and so the vegetation varies a lot by slope aspect. So on our south-facing slopes, like in the upper left here, we have quite a bit of unforested area, some bare ground. We have a lot of desert shrubs and succulents and things like that. Down here in the lower left is also a south-facing slope, or the southerly aspects. We have pinyon and juniper woodlands, and then we have oak shrubs. I think this is Quercus undulata here. But on the north-facing slopes, we do have fairly dense forests. This is where we have our southwestern white pine and Douglas fir on our northerly aspects, as well as down in our lower valley bottoms where we have more shade and more moisture. Okay, so here's the old story that a lot of you have probably heard something similar before. So this is like a lot of the forests of the Southwest. The story here in the Guadalupe Mountains has to do with fire exclusion. So we take fire out. These are fire-prone forests. Fire is a major ecological factor here, and it's been removed. So one of the first ways that fire was taken out of this system is with grazing. And this happened throughout the Southwest, mostly in the last 2 decades of the 19th century. So, from 1880 to 1900, and that was, when we had the subjugation of the indigenous people, and when they're forcibly removed from the landscape, then a lot of this land was opened up to white settlement, and ranching just took off. So a lot of grazing, mostly sheep and goats, and a little bit of cattle, especially in these high sort of pine forests with grassy understory. Now, when you have livestock grazing in these places, they remove the grass. So that's the finest fuel. The fine fuels are the ones that can react more quickly to drying out. So grasses will dry out when you have an annual drought. And those are primarily the fuels that carry fire. So when you overgraze and take out these grasses, you're consuming those fuels. You still have ignition, you still have lightning strikes, but you don't have any fuel to carry the fire. And then, of course, after grazing became established, then we had official policies of fire suppression, where any fires that started were suppressed and put out by wildland firefighting. So this has been widely studied for a long time in the ponderosa pine forests of the Southwest, as well as some of the mixed conifer forests, so slightly higher elevation with some other species in them. And we see the same pattern. You put grazing in the landscape, you take out the fuels, and then we have a cessation of fire. So this is more or less the process that happens when you have this. Lots of historical accounts and other sources of evidence show that these forests were generally pretty wide open, low tree densities with large trees, and grassy understories, right? And so what kept these forests open is, of course, you can't get a lot of tree establishment. So if you have dense grasses, pine seeds can't generate because they're outcompeted by the grasses. And then frequent surface fire, right? Grass burns, and grass burns really frequently. So that burns up any of the seedlings or saplings that are establishing and keeps the forest density really low. So if we take fire out, if we introduce livestock grazing, especially intensive livestock grazing, we start to go down this red pathway instead of the blue. And so we have reduced competition because you're eating up the grasses, so more seedlings can germinate and establish. And then we have fewer surface fires because we don't have the grass to carry the fires. And so we start to get dense forests, dense tree regeneration. We get suppressed tree growth because the trees are competing more intensively with each other, especially for water. So we have more mortality, increased mortality from drought. We have more mortality from pathogens because we have, again, denser forests. And so we start to accumulate a lot of fuel. We start to accumulate a lot of dead trees, all the increased needle cast that doesn't get burned up. And now we have conditions where fires are going to burn hotter. And now we have, instead of sort of widely spaced big trees, we have trees of multiple sizes. So now fires can burn along the ground. They're going to burn hotter with all that increased fuel, especially woody debris, can climb up into the small trees and then up into the big trees. And we have high severity stand replacing fire. Now, of course, that's a problem from an ecological perspective, from a timber management perspective, and so on. But then another issue that's a lot of recent research is really focusing on this is when you have high severity fire in a forest that typically burned with low severity, right? Not many trees killed historically, but now we're killing lots of trees. What is that going to do for regeneration? So we're seeing in a lot of places here in Colorado, as well as throughout the Southwest, that when we have these big fires, we're not seeing regeneration of trees. We're not seeing ponderosa pine regenerating. Now, is it because we changed the microclimate fundamentally, and now we don't have any shade? We have increased drought, drier soils. Is it that maybe we get a pluvial, maybe we get some wet, a few wet years, and then we'll get a pulse of regeneration? That's still somewhat unknown, but it's concerning right now. And so this is sort of throughout the West, the pattern from high frequency, low severity fire to high severity fire is problematic. Okay, now the Guadalupe Mountains have a slightly different land use history from the majority of the Southwest and the majority of the Sky Islands in the Southwest. As I mentioned, most of the Southwest, grazing was really ramping up by the 1880s. The Guadalupe Mountains, however, it did have grazing, but this happened a lot later. And the main reason is the Mescalero Apaches inhabited the mountains, used it as sort of their last stronghold against the subjugation by the US government. So the Mescalero Apaches were there pretty much all the way until the turn of the 20th century. And so these lands weren't open to grazing until really about 1920, but really didn't get intensive grazing till the 1930s. So one of the questions we had a while back when I started working in this area is, if we had this delay in the onset of grazing and presumably a delay in the onset of fire exclusion, did we have different forest structure and do we have a different outcome than other places that have been so well documented in the Southwest? So like I said, there was grazing in the Guadalupes, again, starting in the 1920s, 1930s. This area was private land. It was a few just really big ranches, mostly kind of wealthy oil people who bought up big chunks of property. And they were sort of hunting lodges and so on, but they also did a lot of grazing of mostly sheep and goats in these areas. Here's some promotional material from I think this is probably from the 50s. Mentioning the grazing that happened. The land, it was organized, some of the landowners organized and donated the land to the National Park Service. This became a national park in 1972. So one of our more recent parks, the only national park I think not Big Bend as well in Texas. And yeah, and once we had the National Park Service took over, of course, we had an official policy of fire suppression, and any other fires that started would have been put out. So when I was a graduate student, I was working with Alan Taylor at Penn State, and the Park Service approached Alan looking at, they didn't know much about the fire history. They were trying to develop a fire management plan. They didn't know how far outside the historic range of variability the forest might have been. You can see here, this is in some of those forests. This picture was taken in 2003 or 4. You can see a big ponderosa pine there, right? You see some larger ponderosa pines in the background, but you see the really dense understory of mostly Douglas fir and southwestern white pine. So we didn't know how different it was from other places in the Southwest and what the appropriate management strategies were. So that was the goal of our study there. So this is the old story, right? Our goals were to develop a fire history to understand the fire regime in the Guadalupe Mountains, identify the changes in forest structure that resulted, presumably would see higher tree density and all of the things that you see when you take fire off the landscape. And then determine whether, you know, high severity fire is more likely or even, you know, inevitable in these areas. So yeah, so this is what we did. We established a bunch of plots in the high country, in the forests, the mixed conifer forest. In those plots, we measured all the trees. We took core samples from the trees so we could figure out how old they were. We measured the tree heights, and we also looked at all the dead and down material as well, right? So we measured the diameters and identified the species of all the dead stuff on the ground. The other thing we did is we looked for fire scars. So the way you reconstruct fire regimes in forests is you can find preserved fire scars in trees, and you can date those past fires using tree ring dating, using dendrochronology. So down here in the lower right, you can see there's a log, and some of the ridges on that log are fire scars. Those are areas where the tree was growing, was scarred by a fire but not killed, and then continued to grow and preserve those scars. So the scars preserved in the rings give us the dates of past fires. So to sort of simplify our data set, what we did is we, because the forest type varies really greatly, mostly depending on slope aspect and slope position. So we calculated what's called importance value. An importance value is just an index of the tree density and tree sizes. So if you have, so you would consider a species having a high importance value if either you have high density of that species or you have really large individuals of that species, or both, right? So we take, in the upper left here, you can see what some of this data looks like. We have all our plots as our rows and all of our species as our columns. And then we took that data set, we just did a cluster analysis to find plots of similar composition. And then we looked at, well, what are the dominant species in those groups? And so we separated out 5 really distinct groups of forest types that are dominated by, so type 1, we have Douglas fir, but it shares dominance with a bunch of other conifer species. Group 2, mostly dominated by Douglas fir. We have a southwestern white pine Douglas fir group, ponderosa pine, pinyon juniper, and then pinyon juniper woodland. So those are our plots. Here's a map of the sort of distribution of these. I always get nervous showing maps to audiences of geographers because I'm not a particularly skilled cartographer. So please excuse my not so great maps. But anyway, this is just thrown on the USGS topo sheet. So the black circles are the plots distributed through the high country. You can see the green tinting is where you do have forest cover. We avoided sort of the northwestern part of the park because there was a wildfire there in the late 1990s that pretty much consumed everything. And then the red triangles are those fire scars. So places where we cut fire scars out of the trees, a handful of living trees, but mostly dead trees. And we're able to reconstruct fire occurrence with those. So here's how we collect those fire scars. You basically look for trees with a scar at the base. So we call these a cat face. And it's sort of like a triangular shaped scar. You can see a little cavity in there, and you can actually see, before you cut in, you can see the ridges of where the tree has grown around past fire scars. So you can poke your head in there and count how many fires have scarred that tree. And if it's a good number, then you go ahead and take it out. The way you cut into this, you cut in with a chainsaw, you make sort of 2 parallel cuts to get a nice little thin slab. And then you bore in with the tip of the chainsaw in sort of the middle of the tree and then from the side. And you pull out a slab of wood like this. Right? And you can see where the tree down at the bottom here, you can see where that's been taken out. Even though most of our material came from dead trees, we don't want to cut them down. We leave them on the landscape. They're important for insects, and they're important habitat for cavity nesting birds and things like that. So to try to minimize our impact, we typically leave these standing, and you can take less than 10% of the circumference of a tree or the area of a tree out, and it's structurally stable and you still get what you need. So when you sand these things to a high polish, this is what it looks like. So here we have our tree rings here, and you can see my pencil marks By using tree ring dating principles, by using dendrochronology, we can assign exact calendar dates to each ring. And this is because we took cores from live trees, and we did have a couple of sections from living trees too. So you can match up that pattern of narrow and wide rings and figure out the dates from all these dead trees that we cut into. The pattern of narrow and wide rings are remarkably consistent between trees, especially in a dry area like this, where if you get a wetter year, you're going to get a really nice wide ring. And if you have a drought year, you're going to get a really narrow ring. So you can use those patterns to figure out exact calendar dates. So what you can see here is the tree started growing in 1636. That's the innermost ring here. And then here at 1685, this is a fire scar. So when this tree was pretty small diameter, I think maybe only about 5 centimeters in diameter, this portion of the circumference of the tree was scarred by a fire, but then the tree survived and it started growing around and it sealed off that wound. You can see that pattern of the rings on both sides there at the bottom, sealing off that wound. But then there was another fire in 1724 and another one in 1753, 1774, 1801, and so on. And so these are the, you can figure out where that scar meets the ring and figure out what year the fires burned in. So this tells us a lot about the fire regime. It tells us the frequency, right? So at any given point, you can calculate the average number of years between fires to figure out fire frequency. But you can also aggregate multiple samples together to get an idea of fire frequency, because any given tree is likely to miss some fires. But if you aggregate them together, you can get a more complete picture of fire occurrence. You can also map these samples out across the landscape and see how extensive fires were. We can infer fire severity, which I'll talk about in a minute. So basically how many trees were killed or how hot did the fire burn. And then we can also figure out the season, so sub-annual resolution of this fire occurrence as well. So this is how we figure out fire season. If you look at an annual growth ring, like this diagram on the left, as the tree grows, so the tree is growing more or less from bottom to top in this left diagram. The cells of the early part of the growing season are typically wider and with thinner cell walls. And so we have sort of a light band, we call it early wood. And then as the tree prepares for dormancy, cells get smaller, interiors get smaller, the cell walls get thicker, and it forms a darker band that we call the late wood. And foresters have figured out in different places, when does dormancy typically break and when does dormancy start again in the fall. So we can divide this up into sort of early wood, middle early, late early wood, and the late wood. And so we can look at where does that scar actually scar the tree inside the ring and figure out what, maybe what month the fires are burning. Okay, so here's our results from that study. For fire frequency, you can see here is the gray line is the sample depth, so the number of samples we had. And then the black bars are the number of scars that we found for that given year. And we can see in general, widespread fires that scarred a lot of trees were happening about every 10 to 15 years in general. The last widespread fire was 1922, which really, that makes sense given that grazing started up in the 20s and ramped up by the 30s. We can see a couple other little scars here that were probably lightning strikes. But by and large, we had quite a bit of fire, relatively frequent, and then it kind of pretty much stopped at 1922. If we look at how does the pattern of fire vary on the landscape, I just put in these couple of tables to highlight this fact that the fires were pretty much burning across the high country. We thought maybe different drainages, different slope faces might be fire breaks, and you'd see different fire frequencies in different parts of the park. But in general, the whole thing was burning pretty much at the same time. So you can see here on the top table here by slope aspect, not much change. These are the point fire return intervals. So just at any given sample, what's the average number of years between fires? And we can see 15 to 20 years. But when we aggregate our samples together, those fire return intervals go down. We're more likely to pick up fires that happen when we have a larger sample size. So we call those composite fire return intervals. And if you look down here at the bottom, for instance, so where you had at least 25% of the trees scarred, the median value there was between 9 and 15 years. If we look at slope position, oh, and that's pretty similar across different slope aspects. If we look at slope position, whether it was lower, middle, or upper slope, the same kind of thing, not much variability between them. And if we look at the widespread fires, 25% or more scarred, we see about 12 to 15 years there. So fires are relatively frequent, 10 to 15 years, and widespread, and don't seem to be influenced by slope, by topography very much. Now, fire severity, we suspect is pretty low. There's a number of ways. If you look at the sort of age structure of the forest, you can infer this, but what makes a nicer visual here is there's a lot of scars that scarred trees when they're very, very small diameter. Small diameter trees like this don't usually have very thick bark yet, and they're very sensitive to fire. So the fact that we saw a lot of trees that are only a couple of centimeters in diameter when they were scarred makes us think that these were grass fires that were moving really quickly. What really kills a tree is if the fire smolders a long time at the base. That's what kills the vascular tissue under the bark. A fire can be pretty hot, but if it burns by fast, a tree can survive. So we suspect that these are pretty fast moving grass fires. Okay, if we look at the effects of the fire, especially the effects of fire exclusion, here we can see the sort of establishment dates by decades. These are 20-year age classes. And these are our species. So the black is Douglas fir, Pseudosugum menziesii. The dark gray is southwestern white pine. Lighter gray is ponderosa pine, and the white is Colorado pinyon pine. So we can see that we have pretty much continuous tree establishment. So that means it's probably low severity fire because it's not killing a lot of trees. Bigger trees are surviving. Then when we have grazing coming in around the 20s, we can see from the 40s up to the present, or the smallest trees, we see a big pulse of regeneration, especially Douglas fir. You can see in 1940 to 60, a lot of Douglas fir came in. And that makes sense because they're really fire sensitive. So if you take fire out, they can establish. And they're also very shade tolerant, so they can grow underneath in the shade of other species. So we see a big influx of Douglas fir, but pines as well. If we look at the compositional change, right? So how does the ratio of species change on the landscape? We can see some interesting changes too. So if we look at just overstory versus understory. So in this graph, so this is an ordination graph. So we're using, in this case, detrended correspondence analysis, but you might have seen like non-metric multidimensional scaling or some of these things. We're looking at multidimensional species space and where does the composition of the stand move to? What we really just have to consider is that the species labels here, so southwestern white pine, Douglas fir, in this plot, that would be the center of sort of highest dominance of those species. So a point closer to a species would be dominated by that species. So what we see is in group 3, our southwestern white pine Douglas fir type, we start off in species space here closer to southwestern white pine, and it moves towards Douglas fir. So we're seeing compositional shift from pine to fir, which makes sense given the shade tolerant nature of Douglas fir. The Douglas fir group didn't change very much. Overstory and understory are Douglas fir. Our mixed conifer type has moved closer to Douglas fir, right? Ponderosa pine and is moving more towards juniper and pinyon pine. So again, the understory, we're getting different species establishing. So not only structural change, but compositional change once you take fire out of the system. Okay, now the interesting thing that wasn't in that the 2007 paper we can reconstruct what forests looked like in the past, especially at the time of the last fire. So the way we do this, you can see here, if we look at the left figure, this is just tree density, overall tree density, so stems per hectare. 2003, that was the tally. Those were the trees that we measured and counted in our plots. And so again, the black is Douglas fir, the dark gray is southwestern white pine. But then if we want to reconstruct past forests, well, we just take out the trees that established since 1922, the last fire. We have cores, so we can shrink back based on their growth rates. We can shrink back the trees that have been established before 1922 and shrink their diameters down to the right size. And then we can raise the dead stuff back up. We can bring the dead stuff back to life and put it back in the stand. Now, the reason we can do that is because we know that there hasn't been fire since 1922. And this is such an arid environment that stuff doesn't really decompose. It either burns up or it's going to stay there. It doesn't rot away like in more humid environments. So as long as we have the dead material, we can put it back in. Now, of course, the source of uncertainty here is, well, how do we know how long the stuff's been dead? How do we know when to add it back in the stand? So the way we dealt with that is we modeled the decay of these things over time. There's some work by Pete Foulet at Northern Arizona to do some of this. And what you do is you basically look at what's the status of the dead stuff. Does it have needles present? Does it have the branchlets present? Does it have bark on it? Is it no bark? Is it fallen down? And then you model how long does it take to go from one of those decay stages to another. Now, of course, there's still uncertainty here. So the way we dealt with that is what I'm showing here on this graph, the 1922. We can vary that decay rate and see how sensitive our reconstruction is to the changes in the rate of decay. So what I'm showing here is a bar for the 75th percentile, 50th percentile, and 25th percentile decay rates. And you see, even if you change those decay rates quite a bit, it doesn't really make a big difference in the density of the stand. So we still see a big increase in tree density from less than 200 trees per hectare to almost 1,000. And this is in the Douglas fir mixed conifer type. With basal area, the same thing. So basal area is just the cross-sectional area of the trunk of the tree stem. And it's an imperfect, but it's kind of a measure of biomass. It's also a measure of sort of species dominance. And we see again, a big change. The basal area 1922 is somewhere around a little more than 5 meters squared per hectare to almost 25. And we see this in all the different forest types too. So in the Douglas fir, again, a big increase in density, big increase in basal area, and it's almost all new Douglas fir, young Douglas fir that's contributing to that. And then for the southwestern white pine type, similar pattern, a 3- or 4-fold increase in density, but most of that density in this case, some of it's Douglas fir, but a lot of it's small southwestern white pine that have established. Okay, so the sort of summary from the old story, right? This is not very different from a lot of the Southwest. Historically, in the pre-settlement fire regime, it was high frequency, low severity. So grass fires burning through a relatively open forest. These forests that we reconstructed a little denser than ponderosa pine, but still pretty open. Widespread fires every decade or two. The last major fire in 1922, and then we had no substantial fire after that. And then tree establishment, we had big increases in tree density and basal area starting in the 1930s. And a compositional shift, right? Less pine, more Douglas fir. So our shade tolerant, fire intolerant species. And a big increase in density and basal area. Okay, so there's the old story. On to something more modern. In May of 2016, the coyote fire started burning in the northwestern part of the park. Here's a map from the Park Service on the sort of progression of that fire. It started in the northwest. Don't get me started on the color scheme, but so it progressed through, it burned a little more than a month. burning all the way through the park and through my my network of plots. Helen Poulos at Wesleyan University also had a network of plots up there that overlapped somewhat with mine. So Helen and Alan Taylor and I were on the phone with each other when this fire broke out, and we were so excited that the fire's burning through our plots. So all right, we've got a natural experiment here. We know what happened before. We know what the conditions were like before. We know what tree density was. We know what stand composition was. We know what the previous fire history was. And now we've got a wildfire burning through. So this is going to be great. The Park Service, of course, in their management goals, they were going to let this fire burn as a way of reducing tree density and reducing fuels, right? Trying to make the forest more resilient to wildfire. What we don't want is that inevitable high severity fire just coming in and burning up the whole top with high severity, killing all the trees, because we don't know if we get forest back. So our goals going back in were basically just quantify fire effects, right? So what were the fire-induced changes in composition and in structure? Can we assess the fire severity? Where did it burn with high severity and kill lots of trees? Where did it burn with lower severity? And then can we quantify fuels? The Park Service was definitely interested in how much fuel reduction did you get from the fire burning through. So it wasn't a perfect natural experiment. There was some fire management done on this fire. So where you get highest fire effects, where you get fires burning hotter and killing a lot of trees, typically are upper slopes and ridge tops. And that's because you have convective heat from the fires as they're climbing a slope. The fire has convective heat that preheats and dries out the fuels upslope. So you usually have bigger fire effects upslope, right? You get more trees torching, more canopy destroyed. So to prevent this, the Park Service went in and burned from the ridgetops down. They burned backing fires to reduce those fuels in advance of the main fire, so we wouldn't get a lot of tree mortality in the canopy in some of these places. The other management that they did is they had some historical structures, some old cabins and things from the ranching era that they wanted to preserve. So here you can see a cabin that's been wrapped in some mylar, the fuel's been raked away, and then they're burning to make a fire break in advance of that. Those were largely successful. We didn't see a lot of high severity fire at ridgetops. They didn't lose any structures in the fire when they let it burn through. Okay, so what did we do? We went back there a year and 2 years post-fire, and we found our old plots. We used GPS coordinates, and we had corner stakes in these old plots, so we could find them again, establish them again, and we could measure all the trees. We could figure out which trees survived and which trees died. And we could quantify the density and basal area and all that stuff again. The other thing we did was measure fuels. And this, I didn't measure fuels originally in my plots, but Helen Poulos did. So we had pre and post fuels. So there's a standard way of measuring wildland fuels based on the size classes of the diameter of the fuels. So we call them 1 hour, 10 hour, 100 hour, and 1,000 hour fuels. So 1 hour fuels are a 1/4 inch or less, 10 hour fuels 1/4 inch to 1 inch, and so on. So basically diameter classes. 1,000 hour fuels are about 3 to 8 inches in diameter. And so the standardized way of collecting those and calculating your fuel loads. And so we did that in the plots as well. And so this is when we looked at our plots and where we had different fire effects. Most of our plots were located in low and moderate severity fire effects. So on the left here, you can see a map, and this is the difference normalized burn ratio. So this is satellite derived, this is remote sensing data, where you look at your pre and post fire. It's similar to NDVI. You're kind of measuring greenness, except you use different bands for the NBR. So the satellite derived burn index here, you can see the green areas are low severity. There's some unburned areas in here as well. The yellow is moderate, and then the red is high. We had very few plots in the red, mostly because in the red, that's where you had non-forested slopes. These were south-facing slopes that didn't have trees that we didn't sample originally anyway. Over here on the right, this picture kind of shows what a typical moderate severity stand would look like. You can see green up high there. The canopy trees were generally survived, but the litter layer, you can see some charred chunks of wood down here. The litter layer was pretty much burned away. What we see here is probably just 1 year's worth of needles that accumulated. And then even our sort of intermediate sized trees that were in the subcanopy were fire killed. You can see bark char all the way up this. Usually that's several meters of char height on the stems in a moderate severity plot. Over here on the left, this is what a low severity plot would look like. The fire did actually burn through here. And the reason we know is these small, you see these small sapling sized trees. This is what the big increase in density was, with fire exclusion. It was all these really small Douglas fir and southwestern white pine. And so these all were killed by the fire. If you look down at the bases here, there's char, only a few centimeters high, but there's bark char here. And these trees were killed by the fire. In fact, there's still, you can see some red needles attached here, which shows they were alive within a year. But the large, there's still quite a bit of litter layer left on the surface. There's still a lot of coarse woody debris. This is places where the fire moved through quickly, killed those small trees, but didn't really consume a lot of fuel. And the canopy is intact as well. On the right, we can see a high severity plot. This is a very large ponderosa pine that torched all the way up. You can see bare soil there. All the litter was consumed. Small trees are all burned up, and then a lot of mortality. You can also see this is 1 year post-fire. You can see a lot of grass regeneration in there as well. So some diversity in effects, but most of our plots were low severity. So they look like this one on the left. Okay. Oh, I put this in as an aside just because it makes me happy. It was kind of like going back in time to my graduate school days when I went to sample these old plots, and I found all these trees that I cut little blocks of wood out of, and everyone I found was still standing. So I was very happy that I didn't, clear cut all the dead trees down in the park. And then this one was especially cool because you could see there's a couple of, I'll zoom in, there's a couple of birds' nests in here. So maybe we even added, I'm not an ornithologist, but maybe we added some habitat value. I don't know. Anyway, so the results from our reanalysis here, when we went back in, not surprisingly, we saw most of our mortality in the lower diameter trees. So up in the upper left here, so this is trees per hectare. So this is tree density in 5 centimeter diameter classes. So 5 to 10, 10 to 15, and so on. So we can see significant decreases. So the darker bars are pre-fire and the lighter bars are post-fire. So significant decreases in density in those lower size classes, less than 20. And that's true across especially Douglas fir and southwestern white pine. This is Gamble oak, which is a common sort of understory species. We saw decreases in those too. Similar results in seedlings. We quantified the seedlings, and seedlings were drastically reduced from all species except the ones that resprout after fire. So Gamble oak here and New Mexico locust are sprouters. They sprout vigorously after fire. The tops get killed, but then you have a lot of shoots coming up. So we had really high increases of those species. Tree mortality, so the amount of dead trees increased a lot. Right, so this is the distribution of dead trees in the 2003-2004 field campaign and 2017-18, and you can see, especially in the small size classes, less than 10 centimeters, almost a doubling of dead trees. So the fire killed a lot of trees, didn't consume a lot of fuels, or it consumed a lot of fuels, but it added fuels too. I'll get there in just a minute. Compositional changes post-fire weren't very major. So in this graph, the blue is pre-fire and the red are post-fire. They're connected by those vectors like in that previous ordination graph I showed you. Mostly we saw reductions in Douglas fir. There was a lot of Douglas fir mortality. So in our Douglas fir group, a little bit of change. Douglas fir mixed conifer group, more change. And in the southwestern white pine, again, less Douglas fir. In the drier site, pinyon and juniper types, we had a shift from pinyon pine experienced more mortality, higher mortality than juniper. So we had a shift from pinyon pine to juniper. But overall, these compositional shifts were pretty small. I had to mess around with the data here to get anything that I could visualize. This isn't in the paper. Okay, now the stand reconstruction. This is what the Park Service, the land managers were really interested in, right? Because they wanted a fire that was going to burn through, reduce tree density, and consume fuels. That's why they let the wildfire burn. They wanted to see how effective it was. So if we compare, so each of these, I've got density in the top 3 panels and basal area in the bottom 3. And we can look at, the reconstructed, the pre-fire exclusion 1922 stand, what we measured in 2003, and then what we measured in 2017 post-fire. And we can see we did get pretty good reduction of density, but not nearly down to what it was pre-fire exclusion. Right, so there's some progress, but still a ways to go if we're trying to get to that level of density, which may or may not be the target. In basal area, same kind of pattern, a reduction, but not as far as the pre-fire exclusion. And then, but Douglas fir, we did see a big reduction in basal area, and that's because in a few stands, we burned up a few really big Douglas fir trees. So that accounts for some of that big reduction in basal area of Douglas fir. And then of course they wanted to know about fuels. So with fuels, so our finest fuels, 1 hour, we actually had a slight increase, not a significant increase, but it was about the same. And that's because although the fire was consuming fuel, it was creating a lot of fuel too. Remember those dead little saplings that I showed in that one photo? Those went from live trees to fuel when they were killed by the fire. So it increased a lot of fuels by killing a lot of those trees, especially the 10-hour fuel. So just about the size of those saplings in that photo, we saw a significant increase in fuels. 100-hour, again, the creation of fuels and the consumption of fuels more or less offset. Only in the 1,000-hour fuels and the largest diameter fuels did we see a reduction, because most of those were on the ground. And this fire didn't kill a lot of big trees, so we didn't add a lot of fuels there. Okay, so conclusions from the newer story. So fire severity, mostly low to moderate. Where we saw high fire severity was in sort of non-forested areas. Severity did vary by topographic position. Ridgetops saw higher fire effects, higher fire severity, more trees killed than lower positions. One thing is that we did have really favorable fire weather when this was burning. So we were in a slight drought, but not a severe drought in April and May of 2016. And the fuel moisture was a little more moist than the median or than the average. So we did have good conditions for burning without, the fire burning high severity. And then of course we did see lower tree density, especially we saw mortality on the smaller size classes of trees. An increase in woody debris, especially those sort of 10-hour fuels. So the take home from this is that, it was considered by the land managers, it was considered a, good fire. It did some of the things that some of the management objectives that we wanted to achieve. So it did reduce tree density, but there's going to have to be more fire in here. So prescribed fire is probably is definitely going to be necessary to consume the new fuels that were created. So and that's not unexpected. You normally, to achieve these sort of management goals, you need to burn multiple times to consume those fuels, especially. So some other things we're working on with this. So we did the kind of fire effects study. We're working on now sort of modeling. Can we build some models that explain and maybe even predict sort of fire behavior in this landscape? So we know what the topographic positions are. We know what the pre-treatment was done, what pre-treatments were done by the Park Service. And we know what the prior structure and composition was. So can we model this? We're running into some problems because we don't have many plots that experienced high severity fire. And so there's not much we can say, but we're still kind of working on that. The Park Service is planning on doing some prescribed burning here, I think coming up this spring. So we want to be able to get in there after those prescribed fires and look at, all right, how effective are those at reducing fuels? And are we getting back, are we helping to get to the structure and composition that we want? And then the other question is, what does regeneration look like here? Now, this wasn't a high severity fire. So this is a really interesting question with high severity fires in the region where you're not seeing regeneration. If we have these lower severity fires, are we going to see regeneration here? And so that's probably a longer term effort to monitor that. I think that's all I have there. I do want to acknowledge my my collaborators, Helen Poulos and Alan Taylor, Richard Gatewood's fire ecologist at Park Service, who's been instrumental in helping guide this research. We had logistical support from a lot of great folks at the Park Service, and then our field assistants, Cam and Kelsey. So I think I have plenty of time for questions. If I'll be happy to address those if I can. Stop sharing.
Raphael, did you want me to handle the end part here too?
Yes, please. I don't want to.
Sorry, I got word of this about 3 minutes before we started. So, okay. So yeah, thank you, John. That was great. Really interesting. So we'll open it up for any questions. I have some of my own, but I'll let everybody else go first in true polite fashion here. So yeah, Kathy, yeah, great.
Thank you so much for the talk. I loved the old and new story, and I can just imagine the excitement when the fire was headed towards your study plots. I was curious if, especially since you sort of had this moment of anticipating, what are we going to find when we go back there to these plots and look what's happened if the fires come through? Were there surprises? What were you sort of expecting to see when you got on the ground?
Yeah, well, I think somewhere in the discussion of that first paper, we maybe had we dialed it back a little, but we had this strong language about like, oh, high severity fire is inevitable. We set the table for this. Look at how dense the forests are and so on. So we were thinking that this could be, really high severity stand replacing event if it got out of control. They did have an event like that in the late 90s in another part of the park. So we were kind of pleasantly surprised. We were kind of in communication with the Park Service, in that whole year before we got out there. So we knew that it was burning at low severity. So we had an idea that it was probably a low severity event, but yeah, we really didn't know when we got out there, which was, it did make it really exciting.
That's great, thanks.
Yeah, Tandy.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I especially enjoyed your discussion about the tree growth rings. And I was wondering, do tree growth rings look the same in trees that grow near streams or other bodies of water versus trees like further away from a water source? Or maybe like, do the burn marks differ on trees that are closer to water versus those that are farther away?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So with trees, so the growth rings vary from year to year, usually in response to climate. So if you have a common signal among trees in an area or a region, they're going to have a lot of, they're basically going to be synchronized based on climate. So if it's dry, you're going to get a narrow ring. If it's wet, you're going to get a wide ring. So you'll get the same pattern, but if you have trees at a more hospitable site, so a site that's wetter near water or something, you'll probably still get the same pattern of narrow and wide rings, but the growth overall will be wider because that tree has more water in any given year. So the growth rates between trees will vary a lot depending on sort of that microsite, is it wetter or drier? But the overall patterns are going to be pretty consistent depending on that year-to-year variation. There's some exceptions. If a tree is in a really nice wet spot and it's just really happy all the time, it might be really insensitive and you don't see much variability year to year. It just maximizes its growth every year. I think I had something else, but I lost my train of thought. Did that answer your question?
Do the burn marks look different?
Oh yeah, not really. So with the scars on there, basically what happens is, you know, fire burns past, it'll char the bark, and if it smolders there long enough, it'll kill the vascular tissue underneath the bark. That's the living part of the stem, is just under the bark. And so you'll get basically a dead section there. And then if you have multiple fires, you know, the tree tries to grow around and seal off that wound. And if you have multiple fires year after year, it'll keep making more scars. But it looks the same regardless. You usually get those scars, those cat faces, on the uphill side if there's any slope, because that's where fuel will accumulate, right? Fuel will kind of roll down slope and be caught by the tree. And that's where the fire smolders longest. But from location to location, the burn marks don't change.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, Fred, go ahead.
See if that works. Okay, yeah. Following up on the tree ring question, is it possible to look at the chemistry of the individual rings and maybe get a indication of prior burns, or if that was you know, figured into the ecosystem at all by looking way back into the chemistry of the rings at all?
So people do things with wood chemistry and dendrochronology. I don't know that there's a lot done with fire, because you don't get, you know, your most obvious response of the tree from fire is that scarring. I don't know that there's a lot of other sort of chemical stuff happening. I mean, maybe deposition from fires farther away. But people have done a lot of stuff with, you know, different sorts of ring chemistry. So for instance, you can see really clearly in a lot of trees all over North America when we started switching to unleaded gasoline, right? Because the lead is in the tree ring. So people have done like environmental toxicology and stuff like that with trees. The trick is that it depends on if the compound can be translocated in the tree. So sometimes trees, if they take up a substance, it'll just go into that year's growth ring. Some substances are more mobile, and so it could be taken up in one year, but it could be moved into another part of the tree. So you have to be careful on what compound you're looking for.
Yeah, I just following up. The only reason I brought that up was because I know that in the Rust Belt areas, those trees around there, they really show the steel, the smelting that went on, and the pollution that was deposited in that area. I was just wondering if it's possible to do the same with fire burns or anything like that, if that manifests itself.
Yeah, I'm not sure if anybody's looked into that. I guess it might be possible depending on what what compounds you're looking for, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, Peter.
This is kind of a question from the perspective of an outsider, as one who works in kind of social geography. I was wondering if, sort of in tandem with this work, whether you worked with people who sort of approach environmental reconstructions from like a completely different sort of base approach. I mean, one of our colleagues does pollen analysis, for example, of lakes, and if you'd collaborated with anyone to kind of, you know, build multiple lines of evidence to tell your story.
Yeah, that's certainly, there's a lot of really good work happening in that, especially with fire, because you get different perspectives from different proxies, right? The trees give you trees give you subannual resolution of when the fires were burning, but you can maybe only go back, the oldest samples I had in this study go back to the 1400s. That's about as far back as I can go, and even then my sample size is small. And then of course there are people that do sort of dendroarchaeology, looking at tree rings and indigenous peoples, right? So you can try to get at population sizes and how that might have influenced the fire history, because most of those fires that are recorded in my in my samples, most of them were probably set by people. And some of them were lightning. It's really difficult to tease that out. Some people have tried, but you can get at that with some of the sort of cultural perspective and looking at population changes of indigenous people. And then of course the lake sediments give you another piece of the puzzle too, because you can go back much farther in time. You can go back thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, and then you can see things like pollen, like you can see maize pollen in there, which you're only going to get if people are there growing corn. And then you can look at charcoal in there too. So if you've got the right place or you're working over large regions, I think there's a lot that can be done, and there's a lot of good work that's been happening there. My main problem is there's no lakes. There's not really a good source of other sorts of proxies besides trees. Maybe pack rat middens, you could get pollen and macrofossils from there. I haven't done any work to try to tie into some of the more archaeological and anthropological research, but that would be pretty interesting, because especially if you noticed on one of my slides, prior to about 1790, we had really, really frequent fire and they were smaller. And then after about 1790, we had fewer fires, but they were more widespread. That may be a human ignition kind of signal. I've always thought that, but I haven't had a chance to, work with somebody who's doing the anthropology to maybe test that hypothesis.
Alicia.
Hi. Yeah, I just wanted to actually follow up on that, because I was thinking the exact same thing when I saw that graph, because I actually used to work using pollen as a proxy and looking at differences in fire severity and fire intensity over time, and also looking at how humans impacted that change over time, pre-European settlement and post-European settlement. And so that particular graph that you were just talking about, I was going to say something that, it does seem like those smaller, more frequent fires were probably set by humans. So it'd be interesting to learn more about that, I think.
Yeah, that's one of those things. I think it was, I think that's probably what's going on. We never really explicitly tested it in this work, but you do see a similar pattern in a lot of places in the Southwest. Tom Swetnam has done a ton of work in Arizona and New Mexico, and you see similar sorts of things. You see not only sort of human influences as sort of populations grow and subside, but also you see these sort of longer scale oscillations. So sometimes you see big shifts in like ENSO, and that can influence some of those things too. So teasing that apart would be a good, I need a student to come along and work on this. Yeah, thank you for that.
Brian.
Actually, thanks again, John, for your presentation. And my question just follows nicely from your final comment. I noticed on your presentation there were quite a few slides with students participating in data collection and I'm sure analysis. From your standpoint, I mean, what are some of these experiences that the students have had working on your projects together from a sort of field-based education standpoint? Because I remember when I was a student coring trees, for example, I don't remember anything about the project I was on, but I remember the experience of being outside, understanding how to measure tree canopy cover visually. I'm curious from your standpoint, what sort of reflections have students shared with you about their experiences in the field?
Yeah, thanks. I involve students, mostly undergraduate students in all my work. I'm at a primarily undergraduate institution here. So so number one, I think it's important because even if they're not going to go on to become forest ecologists or dendrochronologists, I think it's important to give those experiences, those sort of authentic research experiences to students. And that's one of our goals of my department here is to really to get students involved in research at the undergraduate level. Yeah, and in fact, that's one of the main reasons I think Tom mentioned in the beginning that a lot of my work now, I've been doing some work in alpine tree line ecotones. So looking at tree line response to climate change. I do that because there's a lot of great places to do that work in Colorado. And it's easy to get students in the field there. And I've typically gotten, 3 or 4 students in the field each summer, not this past one, but a couple of them have gone on to sort of this kind of work, but the majority of them have gone on to things like medical school and dental school and things like that. And I still hear from them because they saw it as a valuable experience, and some of them have said like this really helped me kind of demonstrate, especially. So I've had a fair number of students that have gone on to medical school, and they've said this is one way of distinguishing myself from the other applicants to med school. It's so selective, and if you can demonstrate that you're interested in research besides just the very narrow sort of biomedical path, it looks really good for acceptance committees and things. So yeah, I mean, I think that's my research here is never really very cutting edge because I don't have a big lab with grad students and so on, but with undergrads we can get a fair amount done, and more importantly, we give them really good experiences, and this does feed into my teaching, right? I teach forest ecology, I teach climate change, so in that sense, keeping current, it really helps inform my teaching too.
Great, thanks, John.
Gregory.
Quick question. I wanted to get, thanks for your presentation, by the way, it was really interesting. And I wanted to get your thoughts on the practice of supplementing or augmenting the tree recovery process after a fire. And I asked this question, so in other words, sort of accelerating the succession process. And I'm particularly curious about that because I came across, and you're probably familiar with this and perhaps others here, there's a company, and there are probably other ones, called drone seed or something like that. Basically, after a fire, they send up drones and they drop these kind of capsules that contain seeds in them. And the idea is to try to get tree cover back as quickly as possible. And the reasons for this are many. I think a lot of it has to do with slope stabilization, and I think one of the big ones is actually it attracts funding for people that are interested in kind of carbon sequestration, because it kind of gets more of that going more quickly. But listening to your talk, it sounds like there's also some potentially competing goals there around sort of trying to achieve a different level of vegetation recovery than these kind of intensive seeding exercises might produce. And so I just wanted to get your opinion, given that you're thinking a lot about this post-fire succession process, what your thought is about these companies and about these efforts to accelerate recovery.
Yeah, that's a really good question and a good point. It depends. So I mean, there's often a big reseeding effort after wildfires where you have, because one of the big problems, especially like in Colorado, where our watersheds can be degraded really easily. So if you burn off all the vegetation, you get a lot of erosion off those slopes. And of course, that has a big impact on water quality. It can really mess up the streams and the reservoirs and everything. So getting like herbaceous material on the ground quickly to have some stabilization of that soil is important. In terms of like regrowing trees, yeah, that's kind of a different matter because so like in the Guadalupe Mountains and in most places in the West, the tree density is so much higher now than it was before we started putting out fires with grazing and fire suppression. And that change, that increase in density, increase in fuel, is not sustainable. That's what leads to higher severity fires. The caveat there is not everywhere. Different forest types, especially our higher elevation forests and our forests kind of further north into the central and northern Rockies. Those forests were probably dense even back pre-fire suppression, pre-settlement. But in a lot of forests, especially the Southwest, we're kind of outside that range of variability. And what it does with these higher tree densities is now these forests are less resilient to fire. They're not going to be able to come back. If you burn off everything, that's where you might want to supplement with seeds, because we don't now, if you've burned up all the seed sources, you're not necessarily going to have trees coming back if your nearest tree is miles away. But so there's a lot of talk in sort of management circles about resilience, right? We're not going to go back to what the pre-settlement forest was, because we're in a different climate regime now. We're in a different, there's people living here, and a lot of things are different. We can't just reset the clock, but we can try to manage for more resilient forests that aren't going to just get totally annihilated in the next fire. And so the long term, and there's a lot of debates there about, prescribed fire. So putting good fire on the landscape to help achieve these management goals is often really contentious. But there's been a lot of studies where if you look at a program of prescribed fire versus a wildfire, the net carbon loss, carbon going to the atmosphere from the biosphere, it's much higher in a wildfire, than repeated prescribed fires. So I've gotten off topic there, but yeah, the whole goal is to really build these sort of more resilient forests. With this sort of introducing seeds, it's not just about seed source. That's one part of it, but also you can have you can put seeds down. They might not germinate, or if they germinate, the seedlings might die, because there's a big climate influence in this too. Ponderosa pine seeds require really a narrow range of conditions to establish. You need a certain amount of moisture and a certain amount of, certain temperature range over a couple of years for those seedlings to establish and actually take hold. So yeah, the seed source is part of it, but it's not the only part. And that's what people are really worried about, the lack of regeneration after some of these big high severity fires. Does that answer your question? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. I know it's a tricky, there's a lot there to talk about. I mean, they're promoting these like seed vessels where they take the seeds and they already embed them in some sort of, it's captured in some, like a vessel like this, instead of just the seeds being dropped, in order to kind of help them assist their regrowth. But I guess what you're saying is that, on the one hand, it's a noble goal and a laudable goal to try to get trees to regrow as opposed to smaller brush to reestablish the forest. But, we should be paying attention to what the tree cover was, many decades ago, and try to reestablish maybe that tree cover as opposed to the tree cover that was there before the fire. Maybe, I don't know. It's
right. I would say in general, probably yes, because what was there before the fire was probably not a type of forest that would be resilient to future fire, right? It'd be too dense and so on.
Precisely.
Yeah, and this is like, there's a classic study by Tom Swetnam looking at, so what are the factors that influence whether you get a pulse of regeneration of trees after a fire? And they did this great study in northern Arizona where the Navajo people were grazing sheep intensively 50 years before Euro-American settlers. And so they had a very different landscape, took off grazing earlier, but didn't have the pulse of regeneration. The pulse of regeneration happened concurrently with the rest of the West. And it was really climate driven. We had this period of 4 or 5 years with wet conditions, and that was a great crop of trees. And so unless you get that, you're probably not going to get a lot of tree regeneration. So the question is, are we now outside our climate window where can that happen or not? And it's a really pressing question right now.
And then I'll just follow up with that with a question that I had. I was curious about kind of your view on more kind of interventionist fuel reductions than just prescribed burning, for example. So, up in like Black Hills in South Dakota, they do a lot more kind of selective cutting, slash piles, burning slash piles in the wintertime, et cetera. This is a place that's kind of near and dear to me because that's where a lot of my family is from. And so you mentioned several times kind of, wanting to make sure to leave the dead stuff on the landscape. It provides habitat, et cetera. And, there's successional reasons perhaps why you would want to leave, some of the fuels and stuff that may be there. But I'm just curious about the balance between all of the benefits of having the fuel in place and actually physically kind of more so removing that fuel to limit those stand replacing fires. Is there kind of a balance to be struck there maybe?
Yeah, that's a really active area of research. In fact, there's a whole, a whole bunch of folks at the Forest Service and universities, fire surrogates studies, right? So so some places where you've got a lot of people living in the wildland urban interface. This is a big problem in Colorado and in a lot of states that are, have sort of urbanized and urban suburban fringe. Yeah, you can't just burn because you'll end up burning people's houses and property. And so there's a lot of research on the what amount of sort of thinning and burning can we do, removal of the fuel and then burning it in piles and so on. And it varies. In some places there's some pretty good success doing that, and in other places not so great. I think you certainly, fire is going to be your most effective tool, land management tool in most situations. But again, we just have sort of problems with, conflicts, right? You can't burn everywhere. Oh man, I lost it's Friday, I guess. I keep losing my train of thought. Fire surrogates.
I think that answers, a lot of it is that, that type of maybe approach is more prevalent in places where prescribed burning isn't an option, perhaps, right? So.
Yeah, and that's certainly true. So, yeah.
Okay, great. Other questions for John before we adjourn eventually? All right, going once, twice. All right. Well, thank you again, and join me in thanking John here. I'll have my mic off. You can hear at least one clap.
Thank you all very much. This is great. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, and I think it's a good reminder, right, that there are, there's a community of us kind of academic geographers and environmental scientists surrounded, not just necessarily in our small kind of, our stovepipes, if you will, right? Like our individual university entities and things. And so it might be kind of interesting to have these kind of cross collaboration kind of opportunities periodically that I think that we're all kind of working on similar things and stuff. So this is great. And thank you again, John, for coming. It was a personal treat for me, especially. And so with that, we'll adjourn and everybody have a great weekend. And I'll see most of you later. And anyway.
Thank you, John.
Bye.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very
Yeah,
much.
that was great.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.